Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about Jeffrey Dahmer and the new Netflix series, which has caused quite the public upheaval on social media. Even on Netflix's side, there have been some repercussions already, so I thought we would talk about that. Now, one quick thing I do want to preface before we get into this. I know this has brought up a lot of feelings for a lot of people, which is fine, but let's just not stoop to name calling, so on and so forth. I opted out of watching the show for one central reason. The central reason was I do believe you have to be in the right headspace to watch these types of shows, and I am not in it. So the opinions that I'm going to be sharing here, you'll see, are not my opinions. They're opinions from people online, from people commenting, so on and so forth. I will share some opinions here and there. They're all opinions about true crime generally, as opposed to true crime specifically in terms of Dahmer. Now, I have a list of things I do want to discuss in terms of the series. They are in no particular order. So there was a lot of critique about this show, I think that goes without saying, but there was also a decent amount of compliments being given to this show. And I wanted to talk about the compliments briefly because there aren't that many, or a lot of them were basically the same compliment. So one thing that I do want to make clear is that the majority of the critique I'm bringing up, if not entirely all of it, in fact, is about the content. So when this show is critiqued, we are not talking about the visuals. We're not talking about how good of an actor or bad of an actor Evan Peters is. It's really just about the content itself and how it is portrayed. In fact, people were saying that visually and in terms of camera work, the content was well made, it was visually appealing, it was full of good acting apparently. So when people critique this, it's not about the quality of the work as much as the lens that's put on this body of work. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. It does in my head. That being said, I do think that when we're talking about such a grisly and gory reality, it can also be hard to see anything visually appealing in that, if that makes sense. So I do think there's a point of contention there, potentially, because people can say, yeah, it might have had good camera work, but still, how beautiful can it be, or how visually appealing can it be to see people murdered in such horrific ways? One of the central elements that people kept bringing up, rightfully so, about this show and why they were opting out of watching it was in terms of the family reactions. Now, a lot of the times when these shows come out, I don't really see much of a reaction from families, and maybe that's because they've been contacted by whomever is making the show, by the writers also, in order to include the correct details and to frame things correctly according to the families who actually lived it. Netflix did no such thing, allegedly. That in and of itself, even as an outsider who hasn't watched the show, that doesn't really sit right with me, because we all know that Netflix has the means to do that. They have the means to reach out. They have the staff that is equipped to reach out. I lived it. Sister of Jeffrey Dahmer victim speaks out. Rita Isbell, the sister of Jeffrey Dahmer victim Errol Lindsay, shared her thoughts on Netflix series Monster, starring Evan Peters. When I saw some of the show, it bothered me especially when I saw my name come across the screen and this lady saying verbatim exactly what I said, Isbell stated. If I didn't know any better, I would have thought it was me. Her hair was like mine, she had on the same clothes, that's why it felt like reliving it all over again. It brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then. She said she was never contacted by the producers about the series. I feel like Netflix should have asked if we mind or how we felt about making it, Isbell said, adding that the show is all about Netflix trying to get paid. This is also a recurring theme. I could even understand it if they gave some of the money to the victims' children, she added. Not necessarily their families. I mean, I'm old. I'm very, very comfortable. But the victims have children and grandchildren. If the show benefited them in some way, it wouldn't feel so harsh and careless. This is a thought that is pretty recurring as well. I've seen a lot of people mention the fact of not being paid, not only not being consulted, which obviously I think is the crux of the matter here, because clearly these are people who went through it, so they'd know better than anyone, so not being consulted, I think is insulting towards them, because if you really want to take an account of what happened and you have the means to, why wouldn't you go to the source if they want to be involved? Let's even just look at this in terms of PR. It doesn't look good to not offer any cut of the pay to the children, grandchildren, or people that will be affected by this, and effectively you're telling their story. So if you can pay them, why wouldn't you? So another relative of Lindsay actually tweeted, and this went pretty viral. I'm not telling anyone what to watch. I know true crime media is huge right now, but if you're actually curious about the victims, my family, the Isbells, are pissed about this show. It's re-traumatizing over and over again, and for what? How many movies, shows, documentaries do we need? This was a big point of contention for a lot of people as well, because if someone related to a victim is saying that they're being re-traumatized by it, a lot of people would, and justifiably so, like myself, opt out from watching it, because after reading this, I was like, okay, if people connected to this aren't standing by it, I don't know how I feel about watching that, knowing that. Does that make sense? Another issue that came up in terms of this show is in relation to racism and homophobia. There's an article that came out saying, Jeffrey Dahmer prosecutor backs Milwaukee cops, no racial/gay bias in case. The prosecutor who put Jeffrey Dahmer behind bars is pushing back against the narrative Netflix put forth in its new show, namely that cops ignored obvious clues because the case involved gay and/or black people. Former Milwaukee DA Michael McCann, who personally prosecuted Dahmer in the 90s, tells TMZ the notion that MPD officers turned a blind eye to Dahmer's victims because of their race or sexual orientation is ludicrous despite what monster the Jeffrey Dahmer story portrays. On racism and homophobia generally, he acknowledges it's been a problem historically in law enforcement, but is still adamant that it played no role in how officers went about handling Dahmer. Of course, not everyone will buy what McCann's selling here, especially seeing how Glenda Cleveland, played by Niecy Nash, alerted Milwaukee PD to Dahmer's behavior many times before he was eventually captured. Many suspect cops wrote her off because she was black. So this point is complicated because I've seen people on both sides. It doesn't seem like there's an active consensus as far as what I've seen online about this point, because some people were saying that it was highlighting the fact that there was a racial bias to begin with, and then there was also a bias that was homophobic, and this is highlighting it. Other people instead didn't see it that way, and on the contrary, saw it as kind of glossed over and not referred to enough, or not really shown enough to really get the idea across to say, hey, these people aren't being taken seriously because of different aspects of their identity, whether it be skin color or their sexual orientation. So Evan Peters comes up often here, which is not surprising since he is the actor portraying the main character, Dahmer. There were people who were criticizing that Evan Peters was used as an actor. Some arguments I don't think were as strong as other arguments, and one of them was that Evan Peters is regarded as an attractive actor, so using him might get people to glamorize and fetishize this more. Now, I definitely see that point, and I have a lot of opinions about glamorizing and fetishizing serial killers. I don't think we can put that on Evan Peters being considered conventionally attractive. And aside from that, I also think that we can't really, everyone's going to be attractive to someone, so I don't really think that you could find someone who everyone is just like, oh, that person's repulsive, or like the makeup they did on him is repulsive, because at the end of the day, he has to stay true and look somewhat at least like Jeffrey Dahmer, because that's the entire point. And on top of that, Evan Peters is regarded as a good actor, so I don't think that was the strongest point against him. I think that if someone wants to glamorize or fetishize a serial killer, they'll do it regardless. Like, what they look like is potentially an aspect of it, but I do not think it will determine whether someone will or not. If you're already in that mindset where you're relating to a serial killer or a criminal of sorts that is so violent, brutal, and aggressive, I think there's a lot to unpack there that is not connected to appearance. One of the criticisms that I think is the most minute of them all is that people didn't want to watch it because they felt like it was a story that was told too many times already, that we have all the information and there's nothing to add to the conversation, which frankly was kind of my first reaction before I knew anything about the families and so on and so forth. I already was kind of meh about it because I'm like, what is there left to say? We've heard this story a billion times. I just don't know what we can possibly add here, what there is of value to add here anyway. And I think there are a lot of people who watch these types of shows or this type of content because they want the information, because they want to try to understand what's going on, because there's this general lack of understanding, right? Because most of us don't relate to the thoughts that these people have, hopefully. If you've heard the story a billion times, what new insight are you going to get? Which is why I think a lot of people who are interested in true crime in a healthy way also wouldn't want to see this a priori, just knowing that it's Dahmer. So in terms of it being dramatized, I think this kind of goes with it being repetitive, is that people were saying that they didn't want to watch it because it was a show instead of a documentary. Someone here said, I was going to watch it thinking it was a documentary. When I saw it was a show, I passed. Something in me just fell off with it being a show. Plus, people romanticizing Dahmer is disturbing because of the show. Now, like I said, romanticizing serial killers has been around for a really long time. Obviously, depending on the lens the show puts on the content, it will potentially push people to romanticize more since they have images and soundtracks and things they can now relate to said killer and turn it into something it's not. There's always people who say, oh, if I'd met the serial killer, they wouldn't have killed me because I'm different. I could have talked to them, blah, blah. Which, we all know is not a thought that is grounded in a healthy reality. So this comment also brings up the fact that it's dramatized, and I think a lot of people had issues with that because, as far as I saw, there were people mentioning that there were certain victims who were amalgamated, is that a word? But victims that were basically taken and turned into one. So there would be two separate people, two separate stories, and they'd be turned into one. And this goes back to even just like the aspect of not portraying the victims correctly. I think that screams disrespect from the get-go, no matter how you portray it, if you're mixing two people's stories and different experiences. There are people that are fighting back on that aspect as well, saying that there are people saying, I watched it and actually liked it because it showcased the victims more than other media and wasn't like torture porn. However, when I read that they didn't pay out the victims' families, despite being that a big respect of the story, I feel guilty for enjoying it. There is also this kind of disagreement on how the victims are portrayed, if they're portrayed enough, and who the focus is on and who it should be on. Finally, in terms of people's opinions, I think this one kind of summarized a little bit where I stand, but a general notion that I think is important to consider. They say, I have not watched it, I feel conflicted. In the past few years, my true crime consumption has gone down because I'm growing a distaste for the execution for a lot of content, which is really, I think, a dominant theme here is just the execution as opposed to a lot of other potential issues. Because the execution basically dictates the mood, the perspectives, if people are going to glamorize it, how easy it is to glamorize, so on and so forth. I used to be an avid true crime consumer, fictional or not, because I found it very intriguing as far as the hows and whys. But the hotel season of American Horror Story with the serial killer dinner episode made my blood curdle, and it has stuck with me since. Anyways, guys, you can let me know what you think in the comments down below. Frankly, I doubt I'll be watching this at any given point, because aside from all these aspects, which I think the most monumental one is the family's reaction and publicly saying that it was re-traumatizing, so on and so forth, that's enough for me. But there are all those other smaller aspects which I think are important to count as well. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons as always, and I'll catch you guys next time.